Hello, I'm Configurable, project leader for LXD, and this is another release live stream. So just a few weeks ago, I did the one for 5.0 LTS and then did a follow-up video that covered the difference, well, what changed between 4.0 and 5.0. This one is a traditional monthly release. So for anyone who's currently on 5.0 LTS and wants to keep that production environment and support, they should stick to the 5.0 version, and that means for snaps using the 5.0 track. That way they will be getting bug fix releases for every few months for the few years to come. This is a new feature release, so this is going to be available to users who run the latest track in the case of the snap, or for those distros that ship those monthly releases. We spent quite a bit of time on bug fixes during this release, so there's not any major feature really. There are a couple of pretty big ones, but primarily the focus for us was bug fixes. Those are in this release and they will be in the 501 release for LTS users. Alright, so let's get started. What's new in LXD 5.1? Well, the first feature, and that's probably the most major one we have, is Sysinfo system call interception. So LXD supports a interception for a variety of system calls, and that's just another one of those. What happens with system call interception is that when the system call is made inside of the container, LXD on the host is notified and can decide what to do with the system call. For most of the ones we had up until now, that meant rerunning the system call with extra privileges to allow an unprivileged container to perform actions that it normally would not be allowed to do. This one is a bit different. Sysinfo is a system call that gets you things like number of CPUs, amount of total and free memory, those kind of informations. And this is not something that really needs any special privileges. The problem is that Linux usually tries to be mostly unaware of C groups in many of its APIs, and that includes Sysinfo. So if you're using a piece of software which calls the Sysinfo system call to know how many CPUs there are, how much free memory there is, it won't be capped to the limit that's applied to the instance. And that can be quite problematic. One example, and the one I'll do in a demo later, is that the free tool inside of Alpine Linux, for example, does not look at files on the file system, but uses sysinfo, and so would report the wrong amount. But now with that option, you can turn it on, and LXD will fill in the sysinfo struct with informations coming from the C groups, and that gets you the correct behavior. All right. The next feature is one that I technically covered in the previous live stream. So I covered that in the 5.0 live stream. That was a mistake. 5.0 itself did not include the new LXC cluster role command. We actually included it a day afterwards, but my local system already had it. So I incorrectly covered it. It was then removed from the 5.0 release announcement. The feature itself will be present in 501, however, because it's a very nice and convenient tiny change to the CLI. But I'll show it again in this live stream. The next one is a change to LXC storage volume info. The API now reports the total size of the volumes, and so the CLI also now shows it. So that just makes it easier to not only see how much space is used on the storage volume, but also what the total size of it is. The next change is a new config option to control the naming of network devices that LXD creates. So when LXD connects a container or virtual machine and it needs to bridge it, it will create a host side device. Normally that's a VIF and then some random string, or tap and then some random string device that shows up on the host and is then bridged. This is all fine, but then if you are doing some kind of custom firewalling or anything that can requires you to know the name of those devices ahead of time. This doesn't work because it's completely random. So there's now a new option that changes the behavior to have LXD rely on the MAC address instead, and will effectively use a subset of the MAC address along with a LXD prefix string to get you the host device name. The next thing is a tiny change to our cluster evacuation logic. Normally, you can configure the behavior you want for cluster evacuation on a per instance basis by setting the cluster evacuate config key. But there's some cases where it could be useful to override that. The one use case I have in mind is if you need to shut down an entire cluster because you need to like turn off the rack or move it to another location or something, then it's convenient to be able to force evacuation with the stop action, so that no workload is moved around, they're just stopped where they are. And then you can, when the machines are back on, you can just do a cluster restore to get them back on. Next item here is ability to, next and last item is the ability to set profiles at the time of an image copy. LXD images for a few releases now have supported being tied to specific projects, specific profiles, sorry. This means that any instance created from that image will get those profiles applied to it rather than our default profile. If the user at creation time passes alternate profiles in the -p option, for example, then this is not going to apply, but that's the set of profiles that will apply if nothing else is specified by the user. So that's pretty convenient feature, especially when dealing with custom images. But yeah, we didn't have a CLI for it, so you had to first copy an image and then manually edit it to add those profiles, and that was a bit tedious. So now we've got a new CLI flag that lets you do it immediately during copy, which is quite welcome. And that's it for what's new in this release. So now to do this again, but with demos, I'm gonna be switching over to a terminal here. Here we go. And the first one to show is Sysinfo. So as I said, the easiest for that is actually to use Alpine Linux. So I can just do Alpine, do the edge distro, and if I call that A1, and then I'm gonna on purpose set a memory limit of, let's say, 112 megabytes. And if I go in that instance and I run free, we can see it shows 63 gigs of RAM, which is quite wrong. The limit is in place, so you won't be able to actually exceed that 512 megs, which is actually the source of the problem. Because a lot of software will look at the total memory and not necessarily go look at the available memory, and that leads to a bunch of issues because they're going to try to allocate far more memory than is available. So let's stop that instance now and then configure it to use system call interception with the new sysinfo intercept, and that should fix this. So we go and edit the config, and the new flag is security syscalls intercept sysinfo, and set that to true, and then start the instance back up. Now if we do the exact same thing, here we go. Now total memory is 512, free is 507, and yeah, 510 available because there's 3 megs in buffer. So that all lines up, it's all nice and clean. And that will now behave the way most applications expected. So anything that calls sysinfo will now see the correct amount of memory and won't try to over allocate. Alright, next feature is LXD cluster role. So let's look at my home cluster here. Got those machines running. You can see that I'm using the oven chassis role here and there, but it's not currently on this machine. So let's try to use a new command to do that. So cluster role add the machine that I want to add it to, and do the oven chassis role. and the role has been added. And if we want to remove it, do the same thing with remove, and the role is gone. So nice and simple. That saves you from having to do a cluster edit, because normally what you do in the past would be do edit and then go and modify the list of roles here at the top. That's not very scriptable. It also risks potential race conditions, so it's easier with cluster role add and remove. The next feature is LXD storage volume info and the addition of the total field to it. So for that, let's create a new storage volume. So I'm creating that on my normal pool. Let's call it foo. Set a total size on it, so that's the total does work. Let's do 5 gigs. And now if I do storage volume info default foo, you can see the new field is here. It shows 5 gigs. Obviously no usage because it just got created now. So that's that feature. Delete the volume. Here we go. The next one I want to show is the instances NIC hostname, so the pattern for the network device. If we look at that Alpine container that's running, you can see that its if0 device here has a host side device, and it's called vif and this random name here. Now, if I restart E1, I would expect that name to change. So I'm just going to show that. Give it a few seconds. Yeah, and it is different. The old one was ended with HDF. The new one is this thing here. So if you were to try to apply like external firewalling or anything to this device, that wouldn't work so well for you. Now, this can be changed. So let's stop the instance. And the setting is on purpose system-wide. It is not instance specific because we don't really want to have a mix on the system. It's really a policy thing. So pick what policy makes the most sense to the system and apply it there. So it is a global config key called instances NIC host name, and the default is random. So if you set it to the default and you start the instance, then nothing's gonna really look any different. It's gonna just pick another random name. Yeah, there it is. V whatever this thing is. Let's turn it off again. And now set it to the MAC address mode. Let's just give it a few. That point's a bit slow to shut down today. I don't know why. So do MAC address instead, and then start it back up. And let's look at it. Yeah. So now we can see it's called LXD and this thing. And if you look at the MAC address underneath, you can see that it's actually the MAC address without the leading 00 prefix in this case. So now you've got something you can actually plan on and use in external firewalls or external tooling. Alright. Deleting that instance. I'm gonna unset the config key to get it back to default behavior. Alright. Next feature is the new evacuation mode. So as I mentioned earlier, I do have a home cluster. It runs a bunch of systems. And say I'm picking this guy here, Antac, and let's look at what it's running. So for that you can do list all projects and then the name of the remote, and I'm gonna want a custom output, so that's the -c for columns, and I want to see the name, this running status, and I want to see the evacuation mode on it. So we can do cluster evacuate. And I want the output filter to only show me this one system. There we go. So you can see that it's running 6 instances and they are currently configured. 4 of them would get stopped during a normal evacuation. And 2 of them would normally be migrated to another system. And so if I was to just run a normal cluster evacuate, like so, it would start by stopping those 4 instances and then migrate the remaining 2. But say I don't want that, I just want everything to be stopped because I'm turning off the entire cluster or something. Now I can do -- action equals stop. and run this. And instead of performing any migrate, they will just all be stopped. The advantage to that compared to, say, doing a LXD stop directly on the instance is that the former running state of the instance is remembered. So if you run that on a machine that's got a mix of running and stopped instances, when you do cluster restore later on, only the instances that were running at the time of the evacuation will be started back up instead of all of them. So that's really the main benefit compared to doing a LXD stop or LXD stop -- all. This is just gonna take a few seconds here because some of those are reasonably large virtual machines that take a tiny bit to shut down. Also, this server is an ARM64 server, so it's not necessarily the fastest thing I've got. But yeah, we should see that at the end of this, we're gonna see all of those instances being stopped and will still be listed, so they will still be on that system as opposed to having moved somewhere else. There we go. And now if I do a restore on it without the action, they're all gonna be started back up. Obviously starting things back up way faster because LXD doesn't need to wait for the actual instance to go through like a full shutdown or startup sequence. Okay, so that's done and they're all gonna be back up and running. There we go. So that's the new flag for the cluster evacuation. And the last feature is the ability to set profiles during an image copy. So for that, I think I actually have a local image that I can delete. So I'm just gonna delete, what's the name? I think it's called Alpine. Yeah, okay. So first of all, I'm gonna be creating a few profiles because right now I only have the default profile, so it doesn't make for a great demo. So let's create 2 profiles, foo and bar. And let's make foo effectively a copy of default. So I'm just gonna do it like that. Oops, that's a bit dumb. I meant to do that. There we go. So now foo is a functional profile. And we can just check that nothing's currently using them. And now let's copy an image. So I can do an image copy. Say I take that Alpine Edge image again. I copy it to my local server. I call it Alpine. And now for the new option, I can do profile and say I want it to apply profile foo and profile bar. If I do an image show, I think that should work. And I do Alpine. Yeah, we see that it's tied to the bar and the foo profiles. And now if I launch something from it, so if I do Alpine A1, there we go, the instance got created. And if we go look at that instance, we can see that it has those 2 profiles applied to it. Just as a reminder, if you do specify something during launch, that overrides it. So if I do launch with default, then we can see that despite the image being tied to specific profiles, the instance is tied to default. And that's it for LXD 5.1. Just moving back to my web browser here. As I said, not a super busy release, mostly because we focused on stability and fixes and things for 5.0, but still a reasonable set of new features. I hope you enjoy it. The release is currently in the candidate channel. It will be released to stable early next week. I'm doing this live stream a bit earlier than usual because I'll be traveling next week, so I can't do it then. But yeah, enjoy the new release. If you've got any questions on the release, recommend you leave it in the forum post that I'm showing here. Otherwise, you can always leave other comments in the YouTube comment section down below. And I'll see you in the next video or in another live stream. Thanks for watching. Bye.